Well, good afternoon, everybody. This is the request for reimbursement or RFR workbook training for the Grants Management Unit for the Victim Services. My name is Julie Linsmith, and I am the Social Service Program Specialist in this unit. I also have Jean, Tracy, and Adriana, who are also in the GMU Victim Service Unit on the call, and we'll hear them talking at points in the training, and we'll let them introduce themselves in a few slides. So thank you all for joining us. If you have questions during the presentation, please put them in the chat box and we will get to them. There are lots of spots for questions during the training. So we have a lot to go over today, and your time is important to us. We just ask that as we offer instruction and communications between our agencies and yours, that you guys pay close attention. Some of the information may be easy for those of you who have had awards for years, but we ask that you still actively listen and try not to multitask during the training, as we hope everybody will be able to learn a few things. Today, we're going to briefly get to know the Victim Service Specialist, briefly discuss what grants the Victim Service Specialist manage, discuss risk assessments, and go into detail on how to fill out the RFR workbook and what documentation we need. We will ask that you either type your questions in the chat box or wait till the question sections to ask them. We will address all questions throughout the presentation. Thank you, guys. So the staff of the GMU is Erica Pond, who's the Victim Services Manager, myself, who's the Social Service Program Specialist, Jean, who is our Grants and Project Analyst. Jean is on the call. I'll let her introduce herself.
Good afternoon. My name is Jean Booth. I've been with DCFS for about 3 years. Most all of you are pretty familiar with me. If you're not, you will be by the end of this year. I look forward to starting SFY 22 with you all. Thank you so much for attending.
Thanks, Jean. Adriana is our other Grants and Project Analyst, and I'll let Adriana introduce herself.
Good afternoon, everybody. It's a pleasure to meet all of you.
And then Tracy is our Management Analyst, so she handles all the RFR processing, or most of it, and I'll let Tracy introduce herself.
Good afternoon, everyone. Yes, I pretty much handle the bulk of the request for reimbursements for the Victim Services Unit. So I'm sure that you'll probably hear from me throughout the year, although I'm sort of considered the quiet person in the unit because I'm usually focused on all the getting the money out as quickly as possible. But I look forward to working with all of you this year. Thank you.
Thanks, Tracy. And then Adon is our Confidential Address Program Officer 1, and he runs that Confidential Address Program. And then our newest staff member is Jenny, and she is going to be the VANS Coordinator and the Crime Victim Liaison. So the Victim Services grants and programs, we have, well, it varies, 3 main grants and then some supplemental grants because of COVID, and then 2 programs that we operate. People might get confused because I know at one point we were one unit with the Child Welfare Grants Management Unit here, and so there are some people who are getting like Title IV and some Child Welfare grants, and that is a different group of people who handle those now. So the ones that the Victim Services Program monitors are the VOCA, Marriage License, FIPSA, and FISA Cares, and ARP FIPSA, which those FISA Cares and the ARP FIPSA are the COVID ones. The other programs that are part of our unit are the Victims of Crime Act Compensation Program and the Confidential Address Program. And then what I also forgot to put on here is the VANS Academy and the Crime Victim Liaison grant, which is our newest grant. So during this training, we'll be using interactive polling. And some of you have attended trainings that we've done in the past will be used to this. Others may not. Jean will post the polling link in the chat. You can click on it. You can open it either on a browser on your cell phone, on your computer, and it'll let you answer questions anonymously so that we can see how much people are retaining and get information. If you do not want to use the polling link, you can also just post your answer in the chat box, but the polling link is a good way if you're worried that, I don't know if my answer is right or this or that. It's just a good way to be anonymous and put it in there. So with that, we'll do a quick few polls to get to know who's on our call. So the first one is, what part of Nevada does your agency serve? A, Clark County, B, rural county or counties, C, statewide, D, Washoe County, or E, none of the above. Good, I'm seeing some answers come in. Hopefully you guys can see those answers displayed on the screen as well. And we got one answer of Washoe County in the chat and one answer of Clark County in the chat. Oh, 2 answers of Washoe and 3 answers of Clark in the chat. Okay. Oh, and if you have not done so already, for those of you who may have joined a few minutes late, please remember to sign in with your name and agency in the chat box to receive credit. It looks like a little over half of our agencies joining us are from Clark County, about 30% from Washoe County, and about 15% from rural counties. Changing a little bit back and forth as people get used to answering it. I'll give you guys 1 or 2 more seconds to answer. Seeing it move a little. Okay, and we'll move on to the next poll. How long have you worked in victim services? A, over 5 years, B, 3 to 5 years, C, 1 to 2 years, D, less than 1 year, or E, none of the above. So we're seeing a lot of people are 5 years or longer, 50%, and then some people in that 3 to 5 range, about 19%, and then 25% in that 1 to 2 years, and then 6% said none of the above. So I don't know, maybe they work in a field that's not victim services and they're just on the training to learn what their victim service unit does. And then in the chat we saw one answer of B, one answer of C, and one answer of none of the above. So with that, we'll go to the next question, which is, I am the primary person responsible for completing RFRs for our agency. True or false? A lot of trues in the chat. One false, some falses coming in the chat now. A few trues. So everybody is welcome to attend these trainings. We really do hope, though, that agencies have the person that's responsible for filling out their RFRs attend this training, as they will be the person who will need to know the most details about completing their RFRs. It is good to have other people on, as it helps with agencies that know what other people in their unit or part of their agencies are doing. But we really do hope that those people filling out the RFRs can make at least one of these trainings. This is the first of 3 trainings that will be offered, and they'll all be about the same, except for the answers that people provide in the polling and the questions. So they will be about the same. You're welcome to attend all 3, but you're only required to have one person attend at least one. So now we're going to switch gears and talk a little bit about risk assessments and how your risk assessments affect your RFR submission. Unfortunately, we're unable to change the name of this tool, as it is a requirement of us to have a risk assessment on all agencies from the Fed. Risk levels consider numerous factors, and it has absolutely nothing to do with our perception of the ability of your organization to perform its goals. It is not something shared with other agencies or with the public, but an internal designation for the DCFS Victim Services staff. It is not meant to be punitive. Rather, it is an indication of how much technical assistance to provide, the frequency of fiscal and programmatic reviews, and when agencies will be monitored next. Risk levels may be adjusted throughout the year at the discretion of the GMU staff, depending on the agency's documentation and situations. Agencies may not request a risk level change. So, risk assessment notification. You will be notified of your risk level when you receive your executed notice of subaward, or NOSA. So if you don't know your risk level yet, you probably haven't got your fully executed NOSA. When you get that email, it's very important to keep that email and pay attention, because it'll have your risk assessment, it'll have your fully executed NOSA, it'll have the grant instructions and requirements, or the GERS, attached to it, it'll have your RFR workbook and your quarterly reporting workbook. So that is a very important email to keep. Backup documentation. So regardless of your risk level, all agencies must maintain backup documentation within the agency. This can be either paper or electronic documentation, but just because you will be a lower risk level and don't have to turn in all your backup documentation doesn't mean you don't have to have it. So regardless of risk level and regardless of what we ask you to submit to us, you should have all your backup documentation for all expenses related to the grant. So low risk subrecipients, the GPA, sorry, I was just reading something. The GPA reviews are something that can change your risk assessment. For example, if the GPA finds that your backup documentation for other categories is not accurate within the agency submitted on the request for reimbursement, this may change the risk level. So low and moderate risk subrecipients may continue to submit 100% documentation if it's easier for them, but you don't have to. You only, if you're low risk, have to submit 100% of your backup for your personnel expenses and then your general ledger. But if it's easier for you to submit 100% of your documentation, you can do that. But you, again, only have to do 100% of your personnel backup documentation and your general ledger. And then once a year, the GPA assigned to your agency will request full backup documentation for one of the months so that we can check and make sure that you are doing everything appropriately. And this is when sometimes risk levels might change. If when the full review is done, it's determined that there are some mistakes or issues. So moderate risk is similar to low risk, but that backup documentation will be requested twice a year. So instead of once a year, it'll be requested twice a year. But again, when you submit your monthly RFRs, it just requires the personnel backup documentation and your general ledger. So high-risk subrecipients have required on-site monitoring. Some of the low and moderate risk subrecipients will receive an on-site monitoring because we do have to do every agency at least once every 3 years. Some are done more frequently. So even if you're low or moderate risk, you may be getting on-site monitoring this year. But all high-risk subrecipients will receive an on-site monitoring. And then they will also have monthly or quarterly technical assistance meetings that could be required, and we'll schedule those with you if they are. And then when you submit your RFR, every month you'll have to submit 100% backup documentation with your RFR so we can check all those. This is just a summary of the 3 risk levels all on the same screen to help it. Some people like the visual all on the same screen, so that's why we did that one. So that's there for you. Things you can't control about your risk level. So the last time we completed an on-site review or monitoring, if it's been a while, that will raise your risk level. And you can't control that. That is controlled by our scheduling. So some people might have a higher risk level because we haven't been to visit you in a while. The total amount of funding you receive from the GMU. So the more funding you receive from us, that increases your risk level. So if you're getting a lot of funding from us, that might cause you to be a higher risk. And then any past findings. We've had past findings in monitorings we've done that will increase your risk. So some things you can do to lower your risk level. You're doing one right now. Attend all required meetings. Reduce the number of budget modifications that you do. Expend all your funds that you are awarded. Submit reports and RFRs on or before the 15th of the month when they are due. Provide all required documentation on or before the due date of request. Have qualified, well-trained staff. List your diverse funding sources on your budget summary. So on that Form 2 of the budget narrative form, if you leave that blank, that raises your risk score because we don't know what other funding you have and how stable your agency is. So it's important that you fill that out for us. meet with your program objectives, meet your program objectives in your scope of work. So make sure that when you write those scope of work goals that they're achievable. While we understand that the nature of the population we serve, having scope of work numbers that state you're going to help 1,000 people when you're only able to help 100 people shows that you do not have an accurate understanding of the population in need. So whereas if you say you're going to help 500 people and you end up serving 450, that's understandable and meets expectations. So even though it's a little under, it's not crazy under. All right, do we have any questions that have come in?
Julie, I have not seen any questions come in just yet. I did just get kicked off VPN, so I'm on a different, you might see my name up a little bit differently on the thing, but I am still here.
Okay.
So
Awesome, thank you, Jean. Computers. All right, does anybody have any questions? I'm going to pause for half a second here so that you can type any you have into the chat box. I know risk assessments stay pretty same from last year, so if you're not a new subrecipient, this is probably just a review for you. All right, I'm not seeing any questions. Feel free to add them as we go. The next quiz question we have for you, or polling question, is which agency risk levels are required to maintain 100% documentation of grant expenditures? A, high, B, moderate, C, low, D, all risk levels, or E, none of the above. So I'm seeing about 13, 10%. It's going down. Everybody's on D now. Everybody, oh, there's a few A's in the chat, but it looks like most people are correct. And D is the answer. So even though only high risk level agencies are required to submit 100% of documentation, with the RFRs, all agencies must maintain 100% of their documentation. Now, the PowerPoint presentation that was attached to the meeting invite does not have the answers to these questions, but when we send out the recap with the frequently asked questions that were asked in the training, we'll send out a new copy of the PowerPoint with the answers in it. We just didn't want people to be able to look ahead and have the answers to all the questions. We wanted you guys to use your brain power and see if you could remember the answer. So the next one is which agency risk levels are required to submit 100% documentation of grant expenditures with their monthly RFRs? So I'm seeing a lot of A's, 100% A's. There's a B in the chat, but mostly A's. And A is the answer, high risk. So what everybody has to maintain all their documentation, high risk recipients have to submit all that when they submit their RFR. Here's the next question. If an agency is low risk, they will always remain low risk for the rest of the fiscal year. Seeing it change a little bit. A lot of false in the chat, and then about 13% true, 87% false in the poll. So that's false. The GMU can reassess agency risk at any time during the year. So if we review any documentation or things change with your agency, the risk may change. So a low risk agency may go up to moderate or high risk. This can happen at any time during the year, and we'll notify you if that does happen. Do we have any questions so far?
Julie,
I have not seen anything pop up. Oh, there you go, Tracy.
Hi, I just want to reiterate that if you are low or moderate risk and you would prefer to submit the 100% documentation, if that's easier for you, please do so. I just would ask if you can choose either a GL or 100% documentation. I'm finding that some agencies are submitting a GL and then portions of documentation, which if we have to submit something for an audit, looks a little questionable. So I just ask if you can please choose one or the other when submitting your documentation if you're low or moderate risk.
Thank you, Tracy. Any other questions, thoughts? Okay, we've covered risk levels, so now we're going to go on to RFRs, or request for reimbursement. RFR stands for request for reimbursement. They're submitted monthly by agencies to get reimbursement for grant allowable expenditures that the agency has made. They consist of a cover sheet that's signed and the backup documentation. Agencies are also required to submit their RFR Excel workbook with each request. Some more overview on RFRs. All RFR requests are paid on a reimbursement basis. So if you have an expenditure that you want to make but you haven't paid it yet, we cannot reimburse you for it. We have to have proof that it's been paid before we can reimburse you for it. Items reimbursed must be during the award period. So if you paid for something in July and it was for something that was a service or a product that was delivered to you before the July 1st for this state fiscal year 22 award, we can't reimburse it because it occurred prior to the award period. If you want more information on that, we have on our website the end of year RFR training. It's a recorded training that goes over the first and last month of an award period and is very useful for how to prorate and do those first and last month of RFR expenditures. RFRs are due no later than the 15th of the month following the expenditure. Just a big reminder, budgets. Please remember to check that an item is on your budget prior to submitting for it to be reimbursed. This year we're going to be a lot tougher on that. All the items on your budget have been approved by a GPA and are known to be allowable expenditures on the award you have. If you're requesting something that's not on the budget, then it has to be researched to see if it's allowable. And so to avoid that, if you have something that you need to expend that's not on your budget, you need to email a GPA, probably Jean, and let her know what's going on to see if you can get approval. It might require a subaward amendment, or it might just be an email approval that will track. But please remember, everything must be on your budget or approved by GPA to be reimbursed. Don't submit an RFR with items that are not on your budget thinking that we'll just pay them. So an overview of the RFR workbook. This is just a reminder that RFRs are paid on a reimbursement basis and that we have to have that proof of payment. Changes to the RFR workbook. So this year there are a few changes that we made to the workbook, and when you get your workbook you'll see this. There are 3 lines for each employee in the personnel section. This is one for each time period or pay period. So I know last year we only had 2 lines. So if you had a month with 3 pay periods, you would need to send your workbook to a GPA to have a 3rd line added for that month. This time we just did 3 lines for each employee in that personnel section. So most months when you only have 2 pay periods, you can just skip that 3rd line and go to the next employee. The workbook's now round to 2 decimal points, and in the personnel section, it will show a hashtag value exclamation point in the column R, grant allocation percentage, until there are values entered in columns D through F of the row. That is okay, and it won't affect the calculations, and we'll see that more when we get to the example part. So RFR workbooks, overview, and practice exercises. Like I said at the beginning of this training, there are some supporting documents that will really help you with the next part to understand what we're talking about and work through it and really learn what we're talking about. So those were attached to the calendar invite. Hopefully you have them. If you don't, email Jean. They are the example NOSA, the example RFR workbook, and an example payroll documentation. So if you can open those up right now, that will really help you. So navigating an RFR workbook. The first tab is the instruction tab, and you'll see it down here at the bottom when you open up your RFR workbook. And then there is an RFR summary tab for each month. there's an RFR and a summary tab for each month. So July, there's an RFR tab, and then there's a July summary tab, and then August, an RFR tab and a summary tab. The instruction tab, please review this prior to working on your first RFR. Many of your questions can be answered by reading this page. And then if you still have questions after reading this page and attending this training, you can consult the grant instructions and requirements, or GIRs. They will be attached to that email with your executed NOSA. And then if you still don't have the answer to the question, you can contact one of our GPAs and we'll be happy to help you. We're here to help you succeed, and we want you to have all the knowledge and resources you need. So the RFR tab, these tabs are locked for editing, and they're populated by entering information into the summary tab. And that has a lot of information on your award and your budget. It's really small on the screen, so please follow along on your example RFR workbook. You can try clicking on most things and you can see that it will not let you because most of it is locked to prevent editing. You can change the values on the sheet by entering information in the summary tab. Like I said before, sorry, a little repetitive. The top of the sheet will tell you the award number, so you can see what award number. So when you're referencing a workbook or an issue that you're having, it's really helpful for us to have the grant award number, and that's where you will find it is on almost all your documents, and it will be also on your RFR workbook. This one is 16575-20-XXX. Yours won't have XXX, it will have all numbers. And then below that, you will see the agency name. This one is Victim Services Agency Incorporated. This is just a fictitious name, and you will see this through our examples. And below that, you will see the agency's address. You want to make sure that this is correct, as if paper checks are ever mailed, which usually we do electronic checks, but occasionally something happens, you want that check to be sent to the correct place. We have to use the address that is with the Secretary of State and Controller's Office. So if you need this changed, we can help you with the process. Just let us know. Next, you'll see the EIN and vendor number. Please check that these are correct. And then you will see on this page has information on your approved budget, total prior request, current request, year-to-date total, and budget balance. This should help you check how much of your award has been expended and keep you on track. So this page has a lot of info that's very helpful. It will let you know how close you're getting to expending a budget. So say 6 months into the 12-month award, you should be about 50% expended on all your budget categories, unless you know that there's a reason that you're going to spend more of it at the end or more of it at the beginning. But you should really be using this to track how you're progressing in your spending. When you go to submit your RFR, you'll need to do two things with this tab. You'll need to check that it's original or revised submission for that month. We'll talk about revised submissions at the end of the training, but for most of them, you'll click original, and then you're going to print and sign this page, scan it, and include it with your backup documentation and the Excel version of the workbook. So now that we've reviewed the RFR tab, let's discuss the summary tab, as this is where most of the work in submitting an RFR is involved. So this is an overview of the summary tab. The summary tab requires backup we'll talk about this and the backup documentation you'll need for each section, and then we'll also go over how to fill out each section. So the summary rows are at the top and they're locked, and if you need changes to the summary information, let a GPA know. Occasionally the indirect rate will be calculating wrong or something will be incorrect up there, but it should be working all right. But it is locked, but you will be able to see as that money populates over the different categories in the different months as you fill out the summary tabs. And do not change any of the formulas in the workbook. That's why it's locked, so you shouldn't be able to, but please don't, if you do know how to use Excel really well, don't unlock it and try to change any of those formulas. So personnel backup documentation. So you need to have pay stubs, activity-based timesheets, or 100% attestation if the position is completely paid by the same grant, all fringe backup, invoices showing employee breakdown, employer paid only will be reimbursed, and proof of payment. And proof of payment for fringe can be listed in the general ledger for low and moderate risk, and a copy or bank statement for high risk. Agencies must submit pay stubs and activity-based timesheets or attestation regardless of risk level. When you submit this sync, would someone who knows nothing about our agency be able to understand this documentation? If your answer to that is no, make some notes to make it easier to understand. We have a lot of agencies we work with and look at documentation for, so it's hard for us to remember specific situations for each agency. So if something's weird or not the usual, please make a note. You can always write notes on any of your backup documentation. We find it extremely helpful. So the first section is personnel. The workbooks are set up to allow 3 pay periods per employee per month. If you have additional pay periods or personnel changes, you have to email a victim services GPA and request changes. This email should have the name and job title of the employee, the effective change date. We will make those changes and return your updated workbook as quickly as possible. The job title is the first thing you'll see in that personnel section, then the employee name, then the grant percentage, then the total formulas at the end are locked. So all those things are things you cannot change. And then you'll enter the total hours paid in the total hours worked. So the total hours, grant hours from the employee activity-based time card, the grant percentage will automatically populate. So I know it says total hours worked, and we're going to talk about that a little later in the training, but it's usually total hours paid. There are a few exceptions to that. And then you're also going to enter the gross wage and check/direct deposit number in the appropriate cells. So we'll go over this in a lot of detail and have some examples, so don't worry if you're a little lost. All costs in this section are employer paid. So when you look at the next part where it says the benefits, so all employee paid fringe is covered under the gross wages from the previous section. So if employee pays part of their health insurance or part of their vision and dental, you can't put that in the employer paid benefits because you're already getting reimbursed that under the gross wages for the employee. So in this, you'll enter the total amount of fringe covered in the appropriate category. If challenges to the workbook arise, contact your GPA. So if you have any questions, you can always contact us. Personnel totals section is locked, so don't edit any of the formulas. Those will auto appear. And the column is derived from the employee's total amount of fringe and gross wage. And the grant allocation is derived from the activity-based time cards. This is your cost allocation. The total reimbursement request column is the total amount of the total and the cost allocation. This is the total you were eligible for reimbursement for each employee. And we're going to go over this again, so don't worry. We'll go over this in detail. But just make sure it's employer paid, not employee and employer paid, because that will cause us problems. So let's practice with employee 1. So you should have the following documents in the example payroll documents. You should have pay stubs, activity-based timesheets, proof of payroll, tax payments, and proof of health insurance payments, and health insurance invoice. So let's fill out the example RFR workbook together using example payroll documentation. Start first with employee 1, Phyllis Gonzalez. Her name is already on the example RFR workbook, so we know that she's either approved on the approved budget or has been approved to be added to the award by the GPA. If she was not on the workbook, we would need to email a GPA with the name of the employee to be added, the job title and job description for the employee, and the month you want them added to the workbook. So say Phyllis was not on there, we would need to email a GPA to get her added. So we're going to work through employee 1 together and then give you a chance to practice with employee 2 and employee 3. So here is employee 1. Phyllis's pay stub for the pay period 1. When we look at Phyllis's pay stub for the first pay period, we will need some of the information to complete this workbook. First, we will verify that the pay period was during the award period for the award. So the pay period was July 1 through July 14th. We're going to say for this example, it's state fiscal year 22, so the award would be July 1, 2021 through June 30th, 2022. So that is going to be during that award period. The second thing we will see is if the payroll was paid during the month of July. Other than the first and last month of the award, all items must be requested for reimbursement during the month that they were paid, regardless of when the cost was incurred. This means if you paid July payroll in August, you would put it in your August RFR. So for more information on the first and last month award period, please see the training on the RFR end of year process on the GMU website. The next item we will need is the total. So we see that it was paid July 15th, so we're okay to put it on the July RFR. So the next item we will need is the total hours paid for the pay period. The workbook will say total hours worked, but in most cases you will need to enter the total hours paid. Some exceptions to this would be if you don't want to bill the grant for the percentage of any paid time off or PTO for employees, or if some situations where workers are paid on a salary basis, not on an hourly basis. If you are not sure about your agency's specific situation, please contact a GPA and they will discuss the specific situation and help you decide the best way to complete the workbook. For example, we will assume that an agency wants to be reimbursed for a percentage of the employee's PTO. So for this one, we're going to put total hours paid, not total hours worked. So it's going to be that 72 plus 8 hours of holiday pay for a total of 80 hours. The next thing we'll need for the workbook from the pay stub is the gross pay for the pay period. And the last thing we'll need is the check number. Later, we will need to use the employee's paid deductions for fringe when working on the section of the workbook, but we will get to that in a few slides. So now you'll see that this information will get entered into the workbook. So you're going to enter 80 hours paid in the total hours worked column on the first line for Phyllis. Then enter the gross wage of $1,200 from the first pay period stub in the first line of the gross wages column for Phyllis. Then enter the check number. We will need to look at Phyllis's activity-based timesheet to get the total hours, the total grant hours. Once we have the grant percentage will automatically calculate. So we didn't get this off the pay stub, that will be on the activity-based timesheet. So what is an activity-based timesheet? It's a special timesheet that breaks employee time down by funding source. It must reflect the total activities for which the employee was compensated by the agency and cover both federal funded and all other activities. It must be signed by the employee and the employee supervisor with firsthand knowledge of the work performed. So here is Phyllis's activity-based timesheet for pay period 1. This is an example of an activity-based timesheet. You can see that the funding sources that the agency has received are listed across the top, and the dates are listed on the left-hand side. Each day, the employee records how much they have worked on an activity for each funding source. The form also totals the hours worked each day and the total hours worked for each funding source for the pay period. It also has a spot for the employee signature and the supervisor's signature. This is an example, and the agencies are welcome to use different formats as long as it contains all the required information. So your activity-based timesheet might not look exactly like this, but it needs to have all that information on it. July has the 4th of July holiday, so all the employees at this company were paid 8 hours of holiday pay. Oops, I clicked too soon. This will allow us to show you how paid time off or PTO is allocated at the correct percentage to the award. Our agency has also created an Excel tool that calculates this for you if you would prefer to use that then do the documentation on your own calculations. So if this calculation we're going to go through to figure out the grant percentage of the paid time off is confusing to you, Jean has made a very easy to use Excel sheet that calculates it for you that you can enter everybody into. And she'd be more than happy to share that and email that to you if you want it. Okay. Agencies should include how PTO is allocated in their policy on grant allocations. This is important because we're going to show you how to do it if an employee works some hours in a pay period, but if you had an employee that took a whole pay period off on PTO, you would want to have a policy on how you're going to allocate that. Is that going to be based on their average grant allocation per the last month or for the last year to date? You're going to want to have a policy on how you are allocating your paid time off. So in this example, you will see Phyllis work 57 hours on VOCA activities. VOCA is the award we are filling out the workbook on. To get the percentage worked, we are going to divide the 57 by the total hours worked. Note that this is not divided by the total hours paid, or you will be short on hours. When we divide 57 by 72 hours worked, we get 79.17%. To get the grant hours worked, we will need to multiply the PTO hours, which in this case is 8, by the VOCA time allocation percentage of 79.17%. Oops, why didn't my arrow come up? Sorry, missing some arrows. Well, we'll multiply that 8 by the 79.17%, and that gives us 6.3 hours. We will then add the 57 hours to the 6.3 to give us a total of 63.3 VOCA grant hours for the RFR workbook. A note is if we add all the time allocated PTOs for each funding source, it should equal the total number of PTO. You will see that 6.3 VOCA plus 1.2 hours FITSA plus half an hour of general funds equals 8 hours. It is also useful to add a note, if possible, on how the allocation was completed. We are seeing a lot of awards lately where agencies are allocating 100% of their PTO to a grant when the worker did not work 100% on that grant. You cannot do that. You need to cost allocate the PTO across all funding sources based on hours worked. So here is how the information will get entered into the workbook. So you'll enter the 63.3 hours paid in the total grant hours column on the first line for Phyllis. The number comes from the calculation that we just did based on the activity-based timesheet. So that's 57 hours VOCA plus the 6.3 hours PTO that was allocated to VOCA, which gives us a total of 63.3 VOCA grant hours for the RFR workbook. You can see that the workbook now automatically calculates the grant percentage for you. So now let's look at how we do the fringe benefits like health insurance and taxes. When you look at page 13 of the example payroll documentation, you will see an invoice for health insurance. Your backup documentation should also show proof of payment. An example of this would be a copy of the check, but for the example purposes, we were unable to create this. So imagine that you have a cash check stub there too. Just remember to include proof of payment in your backup documentation. So let's start by looking at employee 1, Phyllis Gonzalez's health insurance payment. We can see here that the bill for Phyllis was $415.39. We cannot just put this number in the workbook as the employee pays for some of their health insurance. Please also remember to check that the insurance was paid during the month of the RFR you were completing the period and covered dates that are within the award period. So we can see that this was paid in July. We don't know because we don't have the check, but we'll assume. And that it was covering August of 2021. So it will be in the award period. So now when we continue, we will need to look at Phyllis's pay stubs on page 1 and 2 of the example payroll documentation so that we can see that Phyllis paid $10 per pay period for her health insurance. So to add the health insurance cost to the workbook, you must remember only the employer paid cost can be reimbursed. This means that you need to calculate the portion of the health insurance that was paid by the employer. The easiest way to calculate this is to take the total payment and subtract the employee's payment from the check stub. In this example, you will see that we take the $415.29 from the hometown health invoice and subtract the $20, 10 from each pay period to get the $395.30 to enter in the workbook. Remember, you can always make notes on your documentation as it helps us to process it also, and it helps us to know how you got to the number you got. Since this is an example, the health insurance is paid monthly, you will need to divide it by 2 to get the grant allocation correct across the pay period. So $395.39 divided by 2 is $197.70 and $197.69 because of rounding. You will then enter these into the first and second line for Phyllis in the workbook. You will need to repeat this process for any other fringe benefits you might be offering your employees, like dental or vision. So now let's move on to documentation on pages 14 and 15 of the example payroll documentation. You will see a report on the payroll taxes that were paid. You would also want to include proof of payment on the taxes backup, but again, we didn't make that, but remember to include it in your documentation. When we look at the report, we can see that $74.40 was paid for FICA and $17.40 for Medicare for the first pay period. This is what we will enter in the workbook. It is hard to see here, but on the first line for Phyllis, you will enter $17.40 for Medicare in the Medicare column and $74.40 for in the Social Security column. Yeah, it's tiny. Now let's look at Phyllis's pay stub for the next pay period. We will verify that the pay period was during the award period for this award. The second thing we will verify is that the payroll was paid during the month of July. And it was. If it had been paid in August, you would put it on your August RFR. So if they had paid this payroll August 2nd, it would go on the August RFR. The next thing you will need is the total hours paid for the pay period. You will see a total hours will be 60 hours worked plus 20 hours of vacation for a total of 80 hours. The next thing we'll need for the workbook is from the pay stub is the gross pay for the pay period. And then the last thing we will need is the check number. Okay, so then to put that information into the workbook, we're going to enter 80 hours paid in the total hours worked column in the second line for Phyllis. And then we're going to enter the gross wage of $1,200 from the second pay period stub into the second line of the gross wage column for Phyllis. Then we're going to enter the check number, and then we will need to look at Phyllis's activity-based timesheet to get the total grant hours. Once we have that, the grant percentage will automatically calculate. That arrow is not in the right spot. Okay. Let's look at Phyllis's second pay period activity-based timesheet. She took some vacation time during the period, so we will need to calculate the grant allocation of the PTO, just like we did for the holiday on her last pay period. Remember, if you find these calculations too complicated, Jean has created that Excel tool that you can use to calculate this for you. Remember, if you want to get reimbursed for PTO, it must be allocated across all funding sources. I will say this again, remember, it must be allocated across all funding sources that the employee worked in. You cannot just bill it all to one grant. You can bill it all to your general fund if you're not billing it to a grant, but you can't bill it all to any of the grants. And then agencies should include in their policies how they are going to do cost allocation of PTO. In this example, you will see that Phyllis worked 49 hours on VOCA activities. VOCA is the word we are filling out the workbook on. So to get the percentage worked, we are going to get to divide 49 hours by the total hours worked. Note this is not divided by the total hours paid, or you'll be short on hours. When we divide 49 by 60 hours worked, we get 81.17%. To get the grant hours worked, we need to multiply the PTO hours, which in this case is 20, by the VOCA time allocation percentage, which is 81.17%. This gives us 16.2 hours. We will then add the 49 hours to the 16.2 hours to give us a total of 65.2 VOCA grant hours for the RFR workbook. It is also useful to add a note if possible on how the allocation was completed. So now let's see how that information will get entered into the workbook. Enter 65.2 hours paid in the total grant hours column on the second line for Phyllis. That number comes from the calculation we did based on the activity-based timesheet. 49 hours VOCA plus the 16.2 hours PTO allocated to VOCA gives us 65.2 VOCA grant hours for the RFR workbook. You can see that the workbook automatically calculates the grant percentage for you. So, health insurance, we don't have to do this again because health insurance is billed monthly in this example, and it was already calculated and entered in this pay period. For the pay period 2, we see that the same amounts were paid for FICA and Medicare as in pay period 1, $74.40 and $17.40, and we see that it was paid during the month of July, so we can go ahead and put it on this. So after you enter these numbers with all the entries for Phyllis, you will be able to see the total that is automatically calculated based off the grant allocation to the right of the workbook. Since there is not a third pay period, you will see, for this month, you will see the hashtag value on the third line. That is okay, and it will not affect your submission at all. Okay, so that was a lot. Do we have questions? I'm sure we do.
Yes, so we did have a few questions, Julie, and I've been trying to answer them while we go. So, good Lord, I have a lot of screens up. Okay, so our first question was, what is an attestation? An attestation is a signed statement stating that an employee was paid 100% by a specific funding source, thereby eliminating the need for an activity-based time card since all activities are spent on that specific funding source. The follow-up to that was, do you have an attestation sheet for the 100% position paid by grant? Yes. If you would like to use our attestation example, you don't have to, but if you would like to, please go ahead and email me. I did put my email in the chat box. I'll put it in again, and I can go ahead and send that out to you. The next question is, do I need to attach the attestation each time or just once? You only need to send it once unless things change internally. And if you could send that as a separate document, that would be really helpful. That way we can save that in your file and don't have to keep looking for it. If an employee starts working on other activities within the year, then you will have to stop using that attestation and start filling out an activity-based time card.
And if they get a new employee.
Yes, yeah, if employees change, you'll also have to either do the attestation or the time card. That is correct. And then we had a couple requests for the attestation or the PTO calculation tool to be sent. So if you would like either or both of those tools, just please go ahead and email me. I am trying my best to email out as we go through this so you guys have it as soon as possible. So if you do need the PTO calculation tool or the attestation form, go ahead and email me and I will send that out. And that was all the questions we've had so far. If you guys have any other questions, go ahead and feel free to put them in the chat box and we will answer them as we go.
Great,
Hi,
thank you, Jean.
Tracy.
Oh, go Tracy.
Hi, I just asked with the 100% attestation forms, if you can please make it clear by stating the time period that the attestation is for. For example, if it's going to be For the entire year, please put the dates of the award period within the attestation itself. If it's just for the pay periods for the RFR, please make those dates clear too, just so that we know exactly what that attestation covers. And if you would prefer to do for pay periods only, then please include them with each RFR.
Great. Thank you, Tracy. Any other questions? Okay, we're going to walk through another employee example, but this time I'm going to have you guys answering more of the questions. So let's practice it together with Lexi Carr's pay stub. So answer in the chat box, what month's RFR should we bill this on? See, a few people are awake. Oh, there we go. All of a sudden, all at once. Yes, it should be billed in July. How do we know that? We know that because of the date pay. What will the total hours paid for Lexi be? Yes, everybody's got 80 hours. Yes, we will pay 72 hours regular plus 8 hours holiday. What is the gross pay for the pay period? Got some quick typers. Good job. It's $1,120 or $1,220. And the last thing is, what is the check number? Yep, it's 2. I wasn't very creative. I go 1, 2, 3, 4. All right. Great job, everybody. So then let's see how to fill out the information into the workbook. What do we enter on the total hours worked column on the first line for Lexi? What do we enter here? Yeah, I see everybody answering. Great. It's 72 hours plus the 8 hours. What should we enter on the gross wage column? Yep, everybody's got it, $1,220. And what will we enter for the check number column? Yep, 222. Perfect. Now let's see what that looks like. There's the example for you guys if you need it, right under the first line for Lexi. So, oh, I don't know what's going on with my arrows. Okay. Now let's look at Lexi's activity-based timesheet for the first pay period. She has PTO hours, so we'll need to allocate them by funding sources. How many hours did Lexi work on the VOCA award? Yep, I'm seeing a lot of people got it. It's 6 hours. How do we calculate the percentage worked hours for VOCA? How will we calculate that percentage worked hours for VOCA? Yeah, it'll be 6 divided by 72 because it'll be total hours, VOCA hours divided by total hours worked. And what percentage will that give us? Yep, 8.3. Perfect. And so how will we calculate how many PTO hours will be allocated to VOCA? How will we come up with that allocation? Yeah, I'm seeing 2 people's answer. Yeah, okay, so yeah, we will multiply the 8 hours PTO by the VOCA percentage, which is 8.3%. And when we do that, how many PTO hours should be allocated to VOCA? Yes, 0.07 should be allocated to VOCA. And then I'm seeing a few other answers, but it should be 0.7, unless I calculated wrong somehow. And what will the total grant hours be? So what will the total VOCA grant hours be that we're going to enter on that next workbook? Yeah, it'll be 6.7. It'll be the 6 hours for VOCA plus the 0.7 PTO hours allocated to VOCA. So here's the workbook, and we'll enter that 6.7 hours for total grant hours, and it will give us that percentage of 8% there. I really appreciate everybody participating. So now let's move on to the health insurance. What additional documentation should you have for your backup for this? Yeah, proof of payment. Some quick typers. Yeah. Great, everybody. If this was paid on 7/31 of 2021, what month of the RFR should it be billed on? Perfect. Everybody says July. Great. If the award period is July 1st, 2021 to June 30th, 2022, would this be reimbursable for the award? Yeah, yay. Everybody's got it. Yeah, it's for August of 2021 insurance, so yes, it would be reimbursable. What is the total health insurance payment for Lexi? Yeah, it's $1,019.77. What else will we need to look at prior to entering the amount into the workbook? Yeah, her pay stub. What will we be looking for on that pay stub? Yeah. Yeah, great. So now we're going to look at her pay stubs and how much did she pay for her health insurance? Yeah, she paid $110 per period, so we're going to have to subtract the $220 because the health insurance bill was for a full month. So yeah, it's $110 per paycheck, so we're going to remember that we need to subtract the $220. So what information will we need to calculate what goes on the workbook? This is a hard one. It's a big blank page. Yeah. The bill and the pay stub, yeah. Okay, so we're going to need the total payment minus the employee payment to give us the employer cost. So what was that total payment? Yeah, it was $1,019.77. Did I do it wrong? Was it 77 or 17? I'd have to go back to look at the payroll. It's okay. We'll move forward with the 77. Okay. And then what was the employee payment? $220, yeah. And then what does that give us as an employer cost? Do you guys have a calculator? Oops, I put it up there. If you were quick, you saw it. What is that number? Yeah, some quick calculators there. Good. So we want to make sure that it's cost allocated correctly. So we're going to have to divide it by 2 pay periods when we enter it in this workbook. So you'll see that when we divide that $799.77, yeah, we're going to get $399.89 and $399.88. Okay, so now let's look at the taxes. Oh, all the answers are up there for you. The arrows didn't pop up. Sorry about that. But what pay period is this for? What pay period in July? Yeah, exactly. The 1st through the 14th. And should this be billed on the July RFR? Perfect. Yeah, I've seen a lot of yeses. Yes, it should. And we know that because it was paid on what date? Yeah, 7/15. Perfect. You guys are getting it. So what were Lexi's FICA taxes? What did they pay for Lexi? Yeah, 75.64. And then what were her Medicare taxes? 1769. Perfect. Okay. So now we're going to look at that in the workbook, and you'll see those entered in there in that column. And now we're going to speed it up for pay period 2 because you guys are all catching on. So what information do we need from here, from this pay stub for pay period 2? What things are we checking? Yeah, so you guys are getting a lot of them. So we're going to need to check that it was paid in July, that the hours were in the award period, the total hours paid, the gross pay, the check number, and the amount of employee paid benefits. Those are all the things we're going to need from the pay stub. Perfect. I think you guys got all those. And what information will we need from this activity-based timesheet? Grant hours worked, yep. VOCA hours and percentage, yep, for PTO. VOCA percentage, yep. Grant hours and percentage, perfect, yeah. We're going to need the VOCA hours worked, the PTO allocated to VOCA, and then the total grant hours, which is the VOCA hours plus the PTO allocated to VOCA. Great, guys. And then the health insurance we already did together, so we don't need to do that. What information do we need from this taxes? FICA and Medicare amounts. Yep, one more thing. Those FICA and Medicare amounts, and then one more item. The dates, yeah, the check date and the pay period dates. Yeah, we're going to need to check those. So here is what the workbook would look like with everything entered for employee 1 and employee 2. You can see the totals that were way over to the right, so I snipped them on the bottom. Do we have any questions so far?
I haven't seen any pop up, but if you guys have any questions, go ahead and put them in the chat box.
Tracy, do you have any comments to add about any of those?
Nope.
Oh, good. Okay. So we'll
Julie,
move on.
we did have a question pop up. We wanted to know if these are for direct hours only.
So it would depend on the award. VOCA and FIPSA only cover direct hours, but marriage license awards can cover administrative costs. Jean, do you have anything to add to that answer, or Tracy?
I don't.
Okay.
No.
And then for you guys, we have provided a third example of a third employee, so you can practice on your own if you want with the workbook, and it gives you the answer so you can check it. This is what it would look like. If you fill it all out, we're not going to go through the third one for you. You guys got it, but it is there for you if you want to practice. So next, we're going to go on to travel and training. So all travel and training must be pre-approved and on your budget narrative. Again, all travel and training must be pre-approved and on your budget narrative. If you have a training that came up and you have training funds available, but you didn't put it on your budget, you need to email the GPA and get approval for that training. And the training must be related to the purpose of the grant. We can only reimburse after the trip or training has been completed. And we want you to be sure to read all of GERS 22-15 on the allowability of specific costs and GERS 22-17 on travel. These will really help you. We're going to cover a few highlights on travel since people have problems with a few of these sections. So please remember to show on all meal and food purchases if it was for an employee who was traveling or for a victim. So a lot of times it's hard for us to figure out with your documentation if it was a meal for an employee who was on travel status or if it was a meal for a victim. And a lot of times travel and training in the past was put in other. It all needs to go into the travel training section. Meals for victims would go in other, and we would want to know that that was food, emergency food for a victim. So meals for employees are only reimbursable when an employee is in travel status and when the final destination is more than 50 miles one way from the employee's workstation. Document this and the purpose of the travel. Meals or refreshments served during meetings to employees, boards of directors, professional associations, or members of the public are not allowed as reimbursable under grants. So more on meals. Meals are reimbursable at the GSA rate for the employee's destination. So you'll want to provide a printout of the GSA rate for the area visited, and that must be attached to the RFR. I'm going to go into how to check that a little later, but yes, please remember that you need to do that with your documentation. And the actual cost versus the GSA rate depends on the agency's written travel policy. If you reimburse at actual cost, then the agency must include the meal receipt. You can't submit both reimbursement methods. Only one method will be accepted per agency, and it must apply to all travel reimbursements for the agency. So your agency's travel policy should say whether or not you reimburse at the GSA rate or at the actual cost. If you reimburse at the actual cost, we cannot reimburse for tips on meals. If you reimburse at the GSA rate, we won't see the actual receipts, just the printout of the GSA rate, so we won't know if the employee used some of that money for tips. So it'll depend on your policy on travel. So when can employees' meals be reimbursed? Travel to a destination that is at least 50 miles one way from the workstation. They have to depart before 7 a.m. to get breakfast, and they have to depart at or before 11 a.m. and return to work site after 1:30 p.m. for lunch, and they have to depart at or before 5:30 p.m. and return to work site after 7 p.m. for dinner. Meals provided as part of a meeting or conference agenda are not eligible for reimbursement. So if you pay for one of your workers to go to a conference and the conference cost includes the meals, you can't then also get reimbursed for the meals separately to the cost of the conference. That would be double dipping. So we have provided you with the GSA website where you can get the meal costs, the hotel rates, the mileage reimbursement, and these change with the fiscal year each year on October 1st, and agencies are responsible to check the website for the most current rate when requesting reimbursement. So even though on your approved budget you might have the current GSA rate for mileage at whatever the rate is, it's 50 something cents right now, I don't have it memorized. If on October 3rd it changes and goes down, you have to bill at the lower new rate. You can't bill at the old rate that was higher. Most likely mileage will go up because gas is going up, but who knows? So it's your responsibility to check this website and do the printouts when you're requesting travel reimbursement. So here's a little more on travel documentation. A printout for the GSA rate for the location for meals and hotels, receipt for parking, receipts for airfare, receipts for car rental and other ground transportation, and grants do not reimburse for any tips on those or donations. So if you're taking a taxi or an Uber from the airport to the hotel and you tip the driver, that's out of the kindness of your heart, and we can't reimburse that under the grant. You might reimburse that under your own general or fundraising funds to your employee, but we cannot reimburse that under grants. And then we'll need a hotel front desk itemized receipt, and then proof of payment, the credit card statement or bank statement, and then a mileage log and proof of payment to employees for mileage. Travel to and from the employee's residence to work is not allowed. So if you have an employee that lives kind of far from where they work for you, you cannot reimburse them for their mileage on grant funding from home to work. And then if it's travel for a conference, we would like you to include the conference agenda in your documentation. So here is the travel training section. You'll see you'll put a description of the expense. If there is a training, please don't put just the acronym for the training. Please write out the training. It's sometimes hard for us to figure out what the acronym is because sometimes there are multiple things with the same acronym. So it's helpful if you spell out the training name because that helps us. And then the payee or vendor, total cost, and you'll put the check number and the check date. And then you'll allocate it by grants. So if it's 100% charged to VOCA, you put VOCA 100%. If it's 50-50 with another grant, you would put that on there. And then again, there's a reference to the GERS to read about travel. All expenses related to a single trip must be submitted on the same RFR month in order to avoid duplication of payment for elements on the same trip. So if someone travels at the end of July through August, even if you paid some of it in July and some of it in August, you'll request the whole reimbursement on August. So that is an exception to that when it was paid rule. So here are a few questions to see how you guys are doing with that. Did I skip one? No, okay, it was weird on my screen. Okay, an employee transports a victim to court, which is 10 miles from the office. The employee picks the victim up at 10 a.m. and does not arrive back to the office until 2 p.m. Will reimbursing the employee for lunch be allowed under the grant funding? So it's 50-50 on the screen, and it looks like all no's in the chat box. We got any people chiming in want to break the tie? Okay, so now yes is going down and no is going up. So yeah, no, it's not 50 miles from the employee's workstation. So even though they were gone during the work hours for lunch, it wouldn't be reimbursable under the grant for travel. If your agency is requesting reimbursement for in-state mileage reimbursement, what documentation is required? Mileage log and date and purpose of trip, proof of payment to the employee for mileage if the employee's vehicle, proof of gas purchase for vehicle agency or agency vehicle, read that backwards, all of the above or none of the above. Seen a lot of D. Yeah. So you guys are correct. It's all of the above. And I think I saw some questions come in, Jean.
We had one pop in. A question, would the grant pay for a child's meal? Do you want to grab that or do you want me to?
You can go ahead and grab that. I was wondering if they meant a victim's child or a staff member's child.
So yeah, if we're going to specify that if it's a staff member's child, then no, the grant would not pay for that because it's not victim oriented. If it is a child of a victim or secondary victim, or the child is a victim themselves, then yes, we would go ahead and pay for that child's meal. VOCA needs to have as many things paid through gift cards as possible, but if there is an example where you do have to meet with the child or the victim and take them out to eat and you don't have gift cards available, then go ahead and pay for that. But please let us know ahead of time as much as possible so that we can make sure that we note that and are aware that this particular cost is for a victim and not for staff.
And then please remember that victims, if you're buying emergency food for victims, that would go under the other category in your budget and on your RFR for reimbursement, and employee meals for travel would go under the travel and training. And we've seen several times where we get receipts under other for emergency food, and it'll just be a receipt for 2 people at Denny's. Well, it's hard to tell from the receipt whether that was like a victim and the victim's child or if that was the victim and the staff. So please make sure that on all receipts like that you put victim and victim child or 2 victims or whatever, so that we know that we're not reimbursing for employee meal under other without the additional meal requirements for that employee. Did that make sense?
Yes, that was clear, Julie.
Any other questions? Tracy, did you have anything to add about travel?
I just wanted to let everyone know that the lodging and per diem rates are updated by the federal government on October 1st, and the mileage rates are updated on January 1st.
Oh, interesting that there's a delay. So I see a question came in. Did you want to answer it?
Yes. So Yeah, so if it's victim and staff, can you submit a prorated receipt? Yes, if the staff member is taking the victim to go get a meal and it is travel related, for example, you're in rural county and you're taking a victim to a court case of some sort, and it is 50 miles from your agency, you can get reimbursed for both of those. If you're just taking the victim to go get a meal because they left their victimizer and they need something to eat, then and your staff wants to eat with them, then you could not then reimburse the staff and the victim for that meal. It would just be the victim for that meal. And you can prorate that.
I would recommend, this is Julie, if possible,
yeah,
advising your staff to get separate checks. If that's possible. I know not everywhere does that, but that would probably make it a little cleaner and easier. Your thoughts, Jean?
Yeah, that would be fine too. I mean, obviously that would be preferable, but that is kind of a pain in the butt. So if you're not able to do that, or if it's really complicated to do that, you can go ahead and prorate that receipt if you need to.
And if you have something weird come up, you can always email us, and Jean is great at giving answers and letting you know how, and Tracy too, about how to document that the best. And then I see another question came in. Jean, do you want to go for it?
If I can unmute. I use Google Maps for mileage log. Is that okay? Yeah, that would be fine. Just it's helpful to make a note of what the mileage is for when you do that.
Actually, the mileage log should state the employee's name, the date of travel, the reason for the travel, and then the amount of mileage and the mileage rate, and should be signed by the supervisor. So that's actually what the log is. It's sort of like an approval for travel. And then the map is perfect to prove, just to show that the mileage put on the log is accurate.
Usually the log usually sits in the vehicle if it's an agency vehicle, or somewhere in the office if it's employees using their own vehicle, and they usually put but why can't I think of the word? The odometer record for like what the starting mileage and ending mileage is. Perfect. The state travel claim form should work, right, with the map, Tracy?
Yes, that's absolutely perfect.
Great. Do we have any other questions before we move on to operating? Okay. Operating, so the documentation you'll need is invoice, proof of payment, cost allocation. A tip, if you're make sure your proof of payment is not covering part of the invoice. A lot of times we get the proof of payment is over the top part of the invoice, so we can't see that invoice date and a lot of the info on the invoice. So if you can scan them separately, that is great to avoid the obscured information. And also, if a cost is not on your approved budget, make sure to contact the GPA for approval prior to paying it, if possible, but always prior to requesting it for reimbursement. So if your building has a pipe burst and you have to call a plumber, obviously you need to take care of that before contacting us. But before you ask for reimbursement, if you don't have building repair or something like that on your approved budget, you would want to reach out to Jean to see if you need to do a subaward amendment or if she can just approve it via email. Additionally, backup documentation for each subject or section must include, invoice, cost allocation, proof of payment. If the payment is made with a credit card, the credit card statement listing the purchase must be submitted as well as proof of payment to the credit card company for the statement amount. Okay. So here's what the operating section looks like. You're going to enter a brief description of the expense, i.e. rent, enter the payee vendor, enter the total amount of expense for the invoice, enter the check number you paid the expense from and the date it was paid, and then enter the percent allocated to each funding stream. If it's not already listed, type the funding stream at the top, and if you have more than 4 funding sources allocated to the expense, put the allocated amount for the grant in yellow highlighted section, and then provide allocation on information on the invoice. So you would put like BOCA 50%, and then other funding sources in that next column 50%, and then on the invoice you submit, you would have the actual breakdown. All allocations must equal 100%. Most things in the operating should not be 100% allocated to your grant. There should be a split amongst all your funding sources, and backup documentation for each section must include the invoice, cost allocation, and proof of payment. And any questions on operating? Anything to add, Tracy or Jean?
No, I think we're good so far.
Okay.
Yep, I think we're good.
Okay, equipment. Any equipment purchases must be pre-approved by your GPA. That is most likely Jean. This includes electronics of all types. So any type of electronic, regardless of cost, will be under equipment. And agencies must keep a log of all equipment purchased with grant funds. And that log must list the equipment, the date purchased, the funding source, the cost, the serial number, the physical location, the use and condition, the last date inventoried, and the ultimate disposition. And you're going to label all computers and property with property of grant name / number. And most equipment will get labeled with that, just computers. And again, remember to get it pre-approved. And if you want more information on equipment, you can read GER 2222. I suggest you read the whole GER. It's great. And questions? I see one came in.
So we had a question come in that says, do we need to submit this log to BOCA at any time? You will need to show us the log during subrecipient monitoring time. And if we request it anytime throughout the year, you do need to have that available. But you don't have a specific set date or time that you do need to submit that log. It just needs to exist and be available if we do want to check it.
Okay. Any other questions or anything to add, Tracy or Jean?
Nope.
Okay.
Nope.
So on to contracts and consultants. This is one that causes lots of questions. So the GMU specialist, so the GPA must have a copy of the contract prior to the initial RFR submission with any cost for that contract. And we haven't enforced that as hard in the past, but we are going to this year make sure that we have all the contracts, because that is a requirement from the feds that we have copies of all contracts that are on all subawards. And so we are going to not reimburse for any contracts until we have copies of them. The contract should come with copies of applicable licenses if that applies. So if you're contracting out for, let's say, behavioral health services, you'd want the license of the clinician that you're contracting with, and any HIPAA or confidentiality forms that should be with that should also be submitted. And then documentation when you want to bill for, or get reimbursed for contracts is the invoice from the contractor or consultant, proof of payment, and the cost allocation. This again is a change for this year, so we will, the documentation isn't, but us being more strict on it is. So please remember to send those to us if you have them. If you are going out to bid for them and you don't have them, as soon as you get them, please send them to us. Don't forget, or your RFR will be reduced by that amount. Any questions on contracts?
I did not see any pop in. No.
Okay, nothing to add. Okay. Oh. I see 2 questions came in, Jean. Are you on mute?
Yeah, sorry. What is it? A purchase order fee for service, and that does not include vendors. I think I might be a little confused on the question.
Yeah, I'm confused on the first question. I don't know where you saw purchase order fee. Did I have that somewhere on the slide? So the difference between a vendor and a contract or consultant is sometimes confusing. So if you don't know if someone should be under operating as a vendor that you're using or under contracts and consultants, please contact Jean. She'll talk to you about it and you can figure out where it should go. Would you agree with that, Jean?
Yeah. Yeah,
okay.
Generally, if you have questions about where things should go or if they're allowable, just contact us and we can help you walk through that.
Okay, and then some clarification came in on that question. If I issue a purchase order, not a contract. So the question would be like, is a purchase order the same as a contract? It would kind of depend on the situation, right?
Yeah, my initial answer would be no. A purchase order is not the same as a contract. A contract's going to be like a fee or it's a service or something that you're going to pay for. Sorry, go ahead, Jolie.
I was just going to add this. What we'll do is when we send out the summary of the training with all the questions asked, we'll put a definition of what a contract is versus the other. I know the DOJ financial guide has a definition of that, so we can put that in there if that will help clarify. Do you think so, Jean?
Yeah, we'll go ahead and make sure all of those are clear. I know there's been confusion between what an MOU versus a contract versus a secondary subrecipient. So we'll make sure to clarify all of those definitions for everybody, and then we'll add the purchase order versus contract. And then we had a question come in, do you need the HIPAA confidentiality clause if they don't have access to confidential info?
No.
That's a good question. No, I would say no. I would just make sure that that particular contractor really does not have access to any of your victims or confidential info, just to make sure that all your bases are covered. And then, does the contract and confidentiality form need to be submitted with each RFR or only once? That only needs to be submitted once, and it should be submitted before your first RFR submission. So it should be submitted before your July RFR submission.
The only caveat to that would be if the contract expires sometime during the award period. So if the contract is not the same as the award period, you would want to make sure that you send us an updated one once it's expired.
And then, do you need confidentiality forms for volunteers? I would do a confidentiality form for any person that's going to be interacting with your victims or have confidential access to any of your systems or forms.
No, we don't need the volunteer confidentiality form submitted to us, but we might check them when we do monitoring. Would you agree with that, Jean?
Yep, I was just going to say the same thing.
Okay. So we're going to move on to Match. If you have more questions that come up, feel free to put them in the chat. Really love that people are participating and asking questions. So Match requires documentation based on the category. So if you're matching with volunteers or personnel, you're going to require the same similar things as you would to get reimbursed for that category. So volunteers are a little different than paid staff. So volunteers will also need a volunteer sign-in sheet and a volunteer worth printout. So since you're not paying them, you have to show us how you determined how much they are being valued at. But say you're matching with staff that's paid by another funding source, then that would just, as long as it's not a federal funding source, you cannot match federal awards with federal funding, but you would just need the same documentation as to be reimbursed for them. And match should be identified on your general ledger. And for more information on match, you can look at the GER 22-11 cost sharing or matching requirements. And the match section is like a light blue in the workbook. You can see it at the bottom. It's filled out exactly like the previous sections. And again, the documentation is the same as the previous section. Matches required for VOCA and FIPSA awards. VOCA subrecipients who think they will have difficulty meeting the match requirement may apply for a match waiver. There is no match waiver for FIPSA. So if you have both FIPSA and VOCA, prioritize making your match to FIPSA first, since you can request a VOCA match waiver if you are not going to be able to meet your match, whereas FIPSA, we cannot do that. And match can be volunteers, in-kind support, or any services not paid for by federal funding. So for more information, read that GERS or contact your GPA. And I think a lot of people have a lot of match that they don't think of that they could use. So if you want us to brainstorm with you on if you're missing out on any of your match, we're more than happy to do that. Any questions on match?
I have not seen any come in.
Okay, so indirect is the final category on the RFR workbook. And if you have an indirect rate on your award, the RFR workbook will automatically calculate it based on what you submitted in the other category information. So you can see, because we filled out that example workbook for just the personnel, it calculated 10%, which is the de minimis rate. For those of you that don't have a federally negotiated rate and didn't go with 0, it would be 10%. And you can see that the workbook automatically calculated 10% of the cost without you having to enter anything. So a little bit on submitting your RFR. Make sure that all your items are on your approved budget. Look at your budget. Please, please, please look at your budget. We get so many things submitted on RFRs that are not on people's budgets or in the wrong categories, like they're on their budget, but they're putting it on reimbursement in a different category. If it's not on your budget, please email the GPA for approval. They will figure out whether we can pay for that, whether it needs to have a subaward amendment, what needs to be done. And then double check what you entered on your workbook matches your documentation. Write notes on any documentation that you think might need further explanation or might be confusing. Tracy loves to read notes. They make it much easier for her to know what's going on. Then print and sign that RFR tab for the month you are submitting, and put the documentation you are required to submit by your risk level in the order they are listed in the workbook. So if you're high risk, please put personnel, then travel and training, then operating, like in the order you listed them. It makes it so much easier for us. And then you're going to email the RFR workbook, the signed RFR sheet, and the backup documentation to fundsrequest@dcfs.mv.gov. I saw a question come in, Jean.
Yes, so we did have a question come in. Do we need any proof of expenditures for indirect costs? No. However, you do need to have these allocated out on your general ledger so that when we do a monitoring, we can see that the indirect costs were allocated appropriately for the award. Do you want to add anything to that, Julie or Tracy?
I don't. I think you answered that perfect.
No,
Okay.
I just wanted to let everyone know that indirect is the only category that cannot go over 100% on the workbook. Most of the categories we have a little bit of leeway in the budget, so they can exceed the category budget if necessary by 10%, whereas indirect cannot. So just keep that in mind, especially on the final RFRs of the award period. If you're looking at an indirect budget percentage of 125%, I will have to decrease the funding to bring it down to 100%, and that does affect the reimbursement. So I wanted to let everyone know about that.
Yeah, that is a good reminder. Thank you, Tracy. And then we had another question come up. Do we enter the 10% indirect, or is that auto-calculated? The indirect is going to be auto-calculated if it was included on your NOSA. If you decided that you want to have indirect costs halfway through the fiscal year, you're unable to do that unless you have a federally negotiated indirect cost rate with the Fed. If you decide you want an indirect cost 10% allocated in your budget, that would have to be approved prior to issuing of your NOSA, and it will be included in your NOSA documentation on your budget and on your workbook.
Great. Thanks, Jean. I did want to mention, because this does confuse people sometimes, if you chose to do the 10% de minimis, but your budget had less than 10% put into that indirect category, it's okay. When you hit that amount that you had budgeted, then we'll switch the indirect to 0 for the rest of the year. Did you want to add anything to that, Jean?
No, that is an excellent reminder. Yeah, so if you elected to use the 10% de minimis, but you're really only going to use like 3 to 5% of the indirect cost, that is perfectly fine. Just be aware that once you hit your 100% expenditure of indirects, we will go ahead and zero that out for the remainder of the fiscal year or the award year.
All right. I'm not seeing any more, so we'll go on to the next topic, but if you think of other questions, put them in the chat. So revised RFRs. So if you have a cost that came in after you submitted your RFR, or you realize you requested reimbursement for something that you shouldn't have because you got reimbursed on another award or something else, or cost changed, you would do a revised RFR. So it's an additional submission of an RFR, and it would have the additional cost, the removed cost, or the change cost on that RFR workbook. So you would just take your current RFR workbook and go to the month you're revising and add, subtract, change the costs of what you're changing. And then you're going to mark the revised box on the RFR tab for the month. And you're going to print and sign that RFR cover sheet. And then you're going to email that to the funds request email with an email explaining the changes that you've made. That makes it really a lot easier for us. If you put just a brief summary of why you did the revision, it helps us trying to figure it out. And then an attachment with the signed revised RFR cover sheet, and the additional backup for the new items added or the changed items. Don't resubmit all your documentation, just the documentation of the change. And then the Excel workbook for the award. So this is what the sheet looks like, and you would mark this box here revised. And that helps us because when we print them out, if it doesn't have original or revised, sometimes it gets confusing and we're like, which one's the original and which one's the revised? So make sure to mark revised for us. Do we have any questions on revised RFRs? You will have till 90 days after the award period ends to submit any revised RFRs. In the past, we have let people go past that day, but in our GERS, we do have that 90-day limitation, and we'll be using that moving forward because it causes us to have to process a lot of stale claims if we let people do revised RFRs for longer than 90 days. Jean, I think we got a question.
Okay. Yeah, we had a question come in. How do you submit multiple revisions for the same month? I'm going to let you and Tracy handle that one.
I'm going to let Tracy cover that one. What would you like to see on those, Tracy?
Preferably, I'd like to see every change put on a single revised RFR. Is this something where it would be, you don't know, you think you've made all the changes and then you realize a couple of days later you have more changes, and a few days later you have more? Or is this just several changes all at once that you'd like to have made? Well, I'm going to go with I try to do all the changes on a single RFR. So as opposed to submitting numerous revised RFRs.
Okay. Tracy, the question got clarified a little bit. Maybe the original bill was sent in May and then an invoice for May came in June. You did the revision and then submitted, and then another invoice came in July.
Mm. So if the payment was made, it would depend on the payment date. So is this, I'm assuming maybe this is because of the end of the year.
Yeah, this may have to be a specific question related to your organization, Belinda. Generally, if you're going to submit an RFR, you want to make sure that you submit everything that's been paid. If it's the end of the year and you're having issues with some of your end of the year payments, please go ahead and contact us and we can work with you as best we can on some of these. The end of the year RFRs are a little bit different from every other RFR. So it's not really going to be a question that is appropriate for this particular venue, but we are more than willing to help you one-on-one with this specific question.
Great. Thank you, Jean and Tracy.
Yeah.
Yeah. And it looks like it just could happen if something weird happens and you need for some reason to do a second revised RFR on the same month. Just reach out to Jean or myself and we can figure out what's going on and try to help you with that. But it should be a rare occasion, not like common. Award period. We just wanted to talk briefly about this. The first and last month of the award period need to have extra attention, and that's what Jean was kind of talking about. We do have the end of the year RFR training recorded and up on our website, so if you need to access that, that is there. July will be the first month of a lot of people's awards, so there may be some things you might have to prorate if they had partial payment for June. So pay attention to that. That really helps us out in processing your RFRs timely. Services prior to the first day of the award cannot be charged, and some expenses may need to be prorated. So that's what I was talking about. So like if your power bill spans June and July, you'll have to prorate it for just the July portion. And if you had an award last year, you could revise the June RFR to get reimbursed for that June portion. And the grant cannot reimburse for services after the last day of the award, so that'll affect you at the end of the year. So that training is up and available. If you don't know where to find that, we can provide you that link. RFR processing. If an employer item is not on the workbook and or the budget narrative, it will not be reimbursed this year. So you'll need to contact the GPA prior to submitting an RFR with an employee or item not on the workbook or budget narrative. You'll email the GPA prior to submitting the RFR for any workbook changes that may need to be made. So don't submit the workbook to that funds request inbox with the request. Send it to the GPA or the grants inbox, because if you send your RFR submission and then say the workbook needs to be changed, but you have your submission, it's submitted before the changes were made. So just contact us before that. And then all documentation must be maintained by the agency for all RFR requests. And our goal is to process all RFRs within 30 days after the receipt of the request. Taking a few extra minutes when preparing your RFR and following these instructions will greatly increase our ability to meet this goal. So we get so many RFRs that we have less than 30 minutes to process each one. And so anything that hangs us up or causes us delay or to have to reach out to you or do research slows that down and means that we're going to be paying someone late and we're going to get behind on those RFR payments. So anything you can do to help us not have that happen is greatly appreciated. Some final notes. Again, RFRs are submitted on a reimbursement basis. They're due no later than the 15th of the month following the expenditures, and all documentation must be maintained by the agency. If an employee or item is not on the workbook or budget, it will not be reimbursed. I think I've said that like 10 times during this training, but it's important. And the management analyst, so Tracy may request clarification or additional documentation, or if Adriana's processing, she might ask you for that if it's needed. If you don't respond within 5 business days, we'll most likely process the RFR without that item in question, and you'll have to submit a revised RFR for that month to get that cost reimbursed. So make sure if they reach out to you to respond to them as quickly as possible. And again, requests for workbook changes can be emailed to Jean, myself, the grants inbox, and we can work on those. And we'll get them back to you before you can submit that RFR. And again, our goal is to do it within 30 days. Here's our contact information. That RFR submittal is where you'll send your RFRs, that funds request inbox. General questions can go to the DCFS grants inbox. This is great because we all have access to that. So if you send a question to Jean and she's out sick or on vacation, it'll sit there until she gets back. But if you send it to the DCFS grants inbox, I can see it, Adriana can see it, Tracy can see it, we can all access that, and so it won't wait till someone comes back. There's Erica's email, there's my email, there's Jean's email, and Adriana and Tracy's email, so you have all of our contact information. Thank you so much for your guys' time and participation. I think we have some questions that came in.
Yes, so we had a question come in. If there's a month in which you have no expenditures, do you submit a $0 RFR or do we not submit to that month? You would go ahead and submit a $0 RFR. We have to reimburse in monthly order. So if you have expenditures July, August, none in September, but then you have some in October, we can't reimburse the October RFR until we receive that $0 September RFR. And then the next one is, when should we expect our NOSA for the upcoming year? I am working really hard at getting those out. I'm hoping to get, if you haven't received it to sign, you should get it hopefully by the end of this week, if not very early next week. And then could you send the slides? This is helpful info. Yes, the slides were included on the training, but if you need them or would you like them again, go ahead and email me. I'll go ahead and put my email in again.
Jean, send them out the ones with the answer slide if someone emails you, so that
yeah.
they have the.
Thank you, Vicki. She said, nice job on all the spreadsheets and forms. I know how hard this calculating all of this could be. Yeah, it's definitely fun. Thank you.
Hopefully you found it useful. Did you guys find the interactive elements useful? Did you want more of those, less of those? I know the training was long, so I want to thank everybody for hanging in there. We'd love feedback on it. Well, Michelle liked the poll questions. Oh, and totally did too. Yeah, good. I'm glad you guys like the interactive piece. It makes me feel like I'm not talking to myself. Looks like we had a question from Belinda.
Yeah, sorry, they're coming in real fast. We had a question, when will the workbooks come out? The workbooks will come out the same time as your executed NOSA. So if you haven't received your executed NOSA yet, you won't have your workbook. I am working on all of those as quickly as possible. If you haven't received your NOSA to sign initially, you should receive that by the end of this week, early next week, the latest. And then it just takes a few days for us to finish processing them, and you should receive them.
May I add something? This is Tracy.
Yes.
I just wanted to let everyone know that we do send out reimbursement recommendation emails when we complete the GMU portion of the RFR review. That email will state the amount that we are recommending for reimbursement to fiscal. It will also have an updated workbook that will show every single correction or comment, any changes at all will be documented in that workbook. So please, if there are changes, if you see that the amount has changed, please look at the workbook on the summary page for the month of that RFR to see what changes were made. Any changes that are made are based solely on the backup provided or an allowability of the cost. So if you have any questions or concerns, you can reach out to us. You can submit additional documentation on a revised RFR if we didn't have all the information, anything like that. So that's a really good tool to see if there are any things that maybe you need to look at in future RFRs or anything like that, or if you just have questions on what happened, why wasn't the reimbursement 100%, everything is documented in the summary tab of the workbook attached in the reimbursement recommendation email.
And then Tracy, you got to call out that those emails are really helpful to people.
Oh, I'm so glad. Thank you.
We'll stay on for a few more minutes for questions, but I wanted to let you guys know there's an acronym page. I know we use a lot of acronyms, so if you don't know what we're talking about, here's an acronym page. And then here's some additional resources, the link to the GSA rate, the link to our website, Justice website, and then the GERS should be sent with your NOSA. So I want to thank everybody for your participation. It really makes the trainings much, much better. And we're always welcome to feedback. So if you think there's something we didn't cover that we should cover, or we went too slow, we went too fast, feel free to reach out to us with any feedback. And I want to thank you, and I want to thank all the other DCFS staff on for helping make this training hopefully really useful. Jean, Tracy, you want to say bye to everyone? Adriana.
Thank you all for attending.
Bye. Thank
Thank you, everyone.